Okay, we are live. Hi, everybody here and everybody out there on the internet, including Mitchell, who's already asked a couple questions. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. So today the topic is experiments versus theory when it comes to basic income. So this is hi, everybody here and an interesting question because there are a bunch of basic income experiments kind of going on out there and being proposed by various governments, municipalities, also private organizations, etc. And the question is, what can we learn from these experiments? And how are they even defining basic income? How are they defining the desired outcomes of basic income? And how are they measuring them? What can we learn from an experiment that's testing something where, the effects are largely macroeconomic in nature and that they kind of affect the whole economy and all of society overall and, everything. So I want to start by going around the room and I want to get people's initial thoughts on what we need to understand about what basic income is and what we want from it before we can learn from experiments or before we can even design appropriate experiments for basic income. So what do we need to know to be able to properly construct an experiment or test this thing? And just any thoughts you have about basic income experiments or the theory surrounding basic income.
So is the question what we would want to know about basic income that an experiment might theoretically test?
The question is, what do we have to know about basic income already in order to construct an experiment where we can learn something useful, and then what would we be able to learn, like that kind of thing.
Do we need to know?
Or just any thoughts about the topic.
None of us is prepared to answer this specific question, Alex.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just any general thoughts about.
Well, okay, I'll start with what I thought your question was, which is like, what are some outstanding questions I would like the answer to?
Yeah.
And for that, I would say, like, the first would just be the amount. One would be the amount of basic income that is sustainable. Two would be the practicalities of implementing a basic income, especially in the manner that you talk about, where the amount is kind of calibrated to economic variables that are changing. And, like, would you have to kind of artificially keep it stable for people to be able to deal with it psychologically? Or, like, would it just adjust up and down all the time? How would that actually work? Some logistical questions like that. And then third is just about, like, unintended consequences. And in specifically, like, on the macro scale. Like, anytime you change something really, really big in people's lives, especially across the whole globe, like, you just don't know I would feel like I wouldn't know what kind of unintended consequences there might be. So those are outstanding questions. Not all of them are clearly testable in a micro experiment. In fact, probably none of the three that I just listed. So your second question has more to do with, like, if I were going to design an experiment, what would be testable within an experiment? Possibly, like, short-term psychological variables. I mean, it depends on what the scope of the experiment could be. If it could be really, really long, like 30 years, for example, that's really different because you could figure out things like, how does it affect people to know that they're sustainably going to have an income going forward kind of indefinitely? If it's going to be a year and it's only on a small group, you really can only test things like, what is the effect of, like, a short-term increase in your finances that you don't expect to last on things like well-being, which is interesting maybe, but not so relevant to basic income if you expect to have it in the long term. I think. So I guess I don't really know the answer to your second question.
Cool.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Initial thoughts, Nick?
I guess, yeah, I feel it seems to me that it's really hard either to experimentally test or to model in the kinds of models I think that this article is talking about, because at least one of my biggest hopes about it is that it would really change the conditions that the models that have existed when the data sets that the models are based on were generated, and specifically like that people would have more freedom to say no to bad jobs, which would, I think, have pretty, hopefully would have pretty effects. So I think that's real. And I mean, I guess you could test that kind of on an individual level, sort of like the first order effects of that. Like you could see whether in an experiment that only, I mean, assuming it was an experiment that was only giving a basic income to a small subset of the population, you can see, did they quit jobs that were unpleasant. But you wouldn't be able to test sort of the downstream effect of that, which is the changes that would have to be made to those jobs, either paying them better or making the working conditions a lot better. That would hopefully be the result of people turning down those jobs or figuring out a way to get by without anybody having to do those jobs.
Right.
So I think that's a real problem for experiments and models.
So I've kind of talked in experiments have come up in a couple other sessions I've been to about this, and one of my biggest problems is that, all of these experiments don't actually treat basic income as something that they would give to everyone, so you can't really see the impact across like income spectrums, or some of them even target specific demographics, like that one in Alabama or Mississippi or wherever it was, where it's like only for single mothers, which is, again, very great for that group, but it makes it hard to build a study. And one of the things I realized between, reading about some of the experiments and like right now is that we actually kind of do have a really large sample set for something very similar to universal basic income in this country, and that's Social Security.
Right.
A lot of people rely on it very heavily. Some 40% or 50% of people who get it is their only income. And we could, say, well, here's a basic income at $800 a month, and here's a basic income at $1,600 a month, and here's a basic income at $2,000 a month across these spectrums, and see how it impacts different people and how people react to having varying amounts and what the impact of that all is. And, I don't know how many millions of people, 50 million, 60 million people get Social Security, but you could study Social Security in such a way to be able to extrapolate some meaningful information about what it would do across a large population, because currently 20% of the population gets it anyway. So, I mean, it's just sort of like enough research has gone into that I think a lot of it could translate to universal basic income. I mean, not one-to-one necessarily, but it's a huge sample set, and it's, there's been a lot of research on the impact of that and pensions in other countries and et cetera, like, obviously, other countries don't call it Social Security, but they have similar programs as a general rule.
Cool.
I sort of started, I was like, okay, like I understand the question that you're asking, and I was struggling to come up with an answer. I mostly don't have an answer. One thing that occurred to me is that like while there are a lot of things that we don't know about like basic income specifically, of like, okay, what happens when you give like everyone in a set like just money for existing, that there are potentially ways that you can't exactly proxy, but be like, okay, well, what happens when people don't need to worry about paying for X? Like, I wonder if there's a way to use like social services are provided in other, like national contexts. Like, okay, if people don't have to pay or have to pay very little for like healthcare or daycare or different things, I wonder if there's a way to like use that as a proxy in some way to be like, okay, we can see from that people don't suddenly like decide to like really abuse that system. If there's a way that you can try to use that to be like, okay, so then if you just gave people money that they could use for anything, like I haven't really thought this through because I thought of this like 60 seconds ago, but
Cool.
Well, you want to see the societal effects of the basic income, like does recidivism go down for recently released felons or something? Do hospitalizations decrease? Do mental health improve? Do people stay in school longer? Do they go to college? Do they graduate more? Do they things like that? Well, we know that money improves people's lives, but so it's not a question of does it work? It's to what degree and how much and things like that. You can look at how it affects different groups, like the homeless. How they would use it. Would they buy drugs with it? They probably wouldn't, because we've already looked. Other studies have looked into that, but the more studies you have, the more metadata or whatever you can have, and you group all these studies together and say this is what will probably happen, and we'll prove that. And if, like with India, both the opposition and the ruling party look like they want to do a basic income because of a study about 9 years ago, and that showed that it would greatly benefit the population. So it looks like there's going to be a basic income in India within the next 3 years. Like the Kahim or whatever province in northern India.
Sikkim,
that's it. Sikkim. They were the first one to announce it a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Katie, any thoughts? Katie's gonna pass, and I'll read what Mitchell wrote on the live stream. He says, when studying places that have basic income, is it like comparing apples to oranges because each locality, nation/state have different needs and lifestyles? Or, as you ask, do we still have sufficient theory of basic income to help us usefully interpret the results? So to the first question, I think one of the cool things about basic income is that it's just money. So if different people are in different places, and because of where they are or what their circumstances are, they have different needs and different lifestyles, you're just giving them money. So they can buy whatever they need for their particular lifestyle. So I think that's one of the cool things about basic income. But if you're studying specific effects, and the specific effects you're studying have to do with, a particular, social community where things work a certain way, then those measurements of that study are not going to really apply to other people, because the buying power of money is something that's really, really flexible and can kind of adapt. I really liked what David said about looking at places in the economy that are already or times and places, situations where something very similar to basic income, or similar in some ways, has already happened or is already happening. Because then you don't have to go out there and say, hey, I'm running a basic income experiment. You can get massive data from Social Security, or you can look at what we talked about a couple weeks ago, the subsidy reform plan in Iran, where they had something pretty close to a basic income for like 5 years, and there's they've all collected all kinds of data on that, and it's there for people to study. So I don't know if creating new experiments might be useful in some ways, like Richard was saying, like it inspired India to push forward with kind of a basic income agenda. But I think there's a lot of data out there that can be really useful. And another example is the GI Bill after World War II. Obviously that's not going to single women, and it's not there was a lot of racism involved with that. Where Black people were not getting the same benefits that white soldiers were getting, and that kind of thing. But it's a really, really huge group that we can kind of study the effects. And they were spending money into the economy, and they were, being productive. They were able to, buy their homes, and, we talk about this period of, kind of the golden age of, 20th century prosperity post World War II, and that was largely funded by something that looks very similar to a basic income. So I think these are the things we can look at if we kind of want to get concrete information. Yeah, go ahead,
the
Richard.
GI Bill was predicated on serving in the military during World War II and the Korean War.
Well, but everyone got drafted. Like, not everyone, but people across all groups. So you still have like a relatively random sample set. Like, people were exempted for various reasons, and wealthy families and blah blah blah, like always happens. But you really did see the whole spectrum. Like, the Kennedys were drafted. It's like, it's a real thing. Like, they were a wealthy family, they were drafted. You also had poor farmers drafted. Like, you have a whole spectrum there. You have a real sample set.
Right, and it's not 100%, but it is a very large percentage of the citizenship, large enough to affect the flow of money in the overall economy, and large enough to affect production and incentives and all of that. And as David was saying, large enough that you really did have a broad swath of people. So something you can't test with Social Security is a lot of people are worried that if you give people basic income, they'll quit their jobs, whereas Social Security is largely going to retired people. Like, we want to encourage them to quit their jobs.
Well, we want to encourage them to quit their jobs,
right?
But some people don't.
Right.
You still have, like, you can control for some factors to get some decent data out of it. Is more my point. Not that they
Sure. Yes, there's going to be useful data in each one of these kind of scenarios, and then kind of back to the question of what are we trying to measure, and I think that kind of raises the question of, well, what is basic income and what's it for? If you think, and what are the trade-offs? Like, if you think that by paying for a basic income you're trading off with something else in the government budget, you have to say, well, how does the benefit of the basic income weigh against the benefit of this other program that we're kind of trading off with, or this other form of government spending that we're trading off with? So if your model of basic income involves, well, we have to get the money from somewhere and we have to fund it through taxes or something like that, then the kinds of things that you're going to try to be testing are very different than if you're just looking at trying to fund consumer spending to activate the economy for the benefit of consumers or something like that, without necessarily having an associated tax. So the theory, or the model of what the theoretical model for what basic income is and what it's for, can kind of have a really big effect on what you're looking at when you're testing it. And, like, do we care if people quit their jobs? Like, is that a problem? And that kind of thing. So yeah. I've got some, if anyone has any more thoughts. Yeah,
well,
Nick.
I realized sort of while I was saying it that we were talking about the basic income like situation in Iran.
Yeah.
That would be a great way to, and we read, they were saying that there was some reference to news reports about, thousands of people walking off their agricultural jobs.
Right.
Maybe that's exactly, it was, that was, the way I remember it anyway, that was related as part of the downside that some people saw. Right. This is encouraging people to be lazy. It's like enabling people to be lazy.
Right.
And so that's one of the. But maybe it's exactly this thing that I was saying. I hoped would be enabled, actually happening. So.
Right, like maybe we didn't need all those farm workers farming that food. Maybe we,
Right, and if the consequence is that you have to pay people more to do that particular kind of harvest, then maybe the right thing to do is have that kind of stuff is more expensive, and so people should eat something else that doesn't require as much.
And it might incentivize the economy to build out more efficient ways to produce the food.
Like they might not be as automated because they haven't had access to Western equipment for the last 40 years.
Right. And the cheaper your labor, the less incentive to automate too. So like you were saying, like people don't have much bargaining power, you don't have to pay them very much, then like maybe it's not worth investing in automation. But if
on the other hand, it makes me worried that these kinds of things are they can be ingrained in a culture, and people can see any kind of change as scary and problematic.
Yeah. And it could take time to make the adjustments too, right? Like I think
it will definitely take time.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm sorry, just to add something. Richard actually asked about prisoners and recidivism rate. So Scotland has a special program that they got as a part of the UK budget to for people is like not a guaranteed basic income or universal basic income, but like a special social welfare program. And since the introduction of this over 10 years, the recidivism rate in Scotland has fallen by 32%.
Wow.
And the per offender offenses or reconvictions fell by 22%. In the same period in England and Wales, for reference, it fell by about 8%. So, like clearly having this like basic fallback program significantly reduces the recidivism rate. And, obviously they're slightly different culturally, but, they're close enough as like comparing two states effectively. So
Interesting.
I just was looking into that while we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah, that's cool.
I
That's
just thought it was
really
interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I know it's kind of a side point, but I know that the first minister of Scotland a few years ago was talking about basic income.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And they're
guess.
actually planning on introducing a basic income in a number of cities in Scotland.
Cool. Interesting. So let's get to a quote from the article. The article we read is What Are Economic Models? From the IMF Finance and Development blog. The author is Sam Ouliaris. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So the first quote is, an economic model is a simplified description of reality designed to yield hypotheses about economic behavior that can be tested. An important feature of an economic model is that it is necessarily subjective in design because there are no objective measures of economic outcomes.
What does that mean?
Different economists will make different judgments about what is needed to explain their interpretation of reality. It means that it's impossible to create a full model of the world without literally recreating the entire world.
I see.
So you have to
leave
make
something
judgments about what to leave out. What are the appropriate things to leave out in order to develop a model that is descriptive and predictive and useful in deciding what we want our policies to be and that kind of stuff.
You can also have like a supercomputer model of things.
Yeah, but you still have to leave something out unless you're literally modeling the entire universe, right? You have to literally recreate the entire universe in order to model every single thing, right?
There's an argument that we're living inside of a simulation right now, and so
Right.
it's possible to do such a thing.
So we'd essentially have to recreate that simulation in order to do what you're proposing, and short of being able to do that, we have to decide what kinds of things we want to calculate, what variables are important, what measures are important. So when thinking about a basic income and the model for a basic income, we've got to understand what we're trying to get out of it. What are we trying to get out of the basic income? What are we trying to achieve? So I think for me, when I think about a basic income, so I think there's in the common discussion about basic income, it's often described as an amount of money that's enough to meet people's basic needs, or kind of like a subsistence level, or based on some judgment of what the poverty level is, what the poverty line should be, and then you say like, okay, the basic income is this amount, and then you're asking, can the economy handle it? Can we afford it? That kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you want to keep going, or I was just going to kind of rephrase what you were saying
Yeah, go
in
ahead.
a way that was helpful to me. So it's, in a way, sometimes people start with a non-economic reason for having a basic income, in the sense that they feel like there's a certain amount that they want to give people, and
Right.
then the question that's relevant for the economic model, like you said, is like, what are going to be the consequences? Usually the presumably negative economic consequences of giving people this money.
Right.
Or just what are going to be the consequences of giving people the money? Is
Right.
that sort of like one way of approaching it?
Right. They define kind of the amount based on these considerations, and then they ask, well, is it feasible? Is it reasonable? Is it worth the trade-offs? That kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas I tend to think about basic income, I say, the optimal basic income is the amount that's calibrated to whatever the productive capacity of the economy is. So the economy is not going to produce what people don't have the money to buy. I say that a lot. But the economy will produce what people do have the money to buy, and the basic income gives them that money. So the idea is to find a level of basic income that activates a level of consumer spending so that they can get the maximum benefit from the economy. So for me, in testing basic income, the question isn't, is it feasible? The question is, what level of basic income is optimal? And how do we test that? I don't know if there's a way to do that through some kind of experiment, and I don't know that, even if we have like vast data from something similar to a basic income, I don't know how useful the results are going to be. But then again, another question we can ask is, do we need to know the answer? Do we need to know what the optimal level of basic income is? Or can we just say, we're going to design a policy where we're increasing the amount of basic income until we kind of reach the limits of what the economy can sustainably provide for people. And then once we've done that, we've just got an algorithm. The policy is an algorithm rather than a specific amount. And the basic income, increases as we become more productive and develop new technology and stuff like that. And some people might argue that, the amount of optimal level of basic income is very small and even below what the subsistence needs of people are and that kind of stuff. I don't think that's correct. I think I have reasons to believe not. But yeah, go ahead.
I do object to your uses of increase because it is possible that production could go down for some catastrophic reason.
Yep.
So I would say adjust. That's my only
Right.
what you just said.
Might go up or down.
With what you were saying with Venezuela a few weeks ago,
The
how
basic income
since
could go down if the
the
capacity fell.
productivity went down, then the basic
Right.
income should go down.
Right. If the capacity falls, you're absolutely right. If the capacity falls, then the level of basic income we can sustain also falls with it.
Yeah, it's just
Right.
one of those things where it's like the way you
Yeah.
phrase something associates some bias with it. So
I see.
I actually made a decision as I was saying that. I was like, do I want to say increase or do I want to say adjust? And I went with increase.
I object to your use.
So it was a conscious decision. It wasn't an accident.
Yeah.
You called me on it.
Yeah.
So.
So I guess one thing that I'm interested in with your perspective, Alex, is is there anything that you would think about experimenting with first, or that you would want to see an experiment on, or that you would take as value from an experiment? Because so much of what you're talking about, as many of us mentioned going around, is the macroeconomic effects.
Yeah. So I would say that no. I would say there's nothing we can usefully learn from testing basic income or running basic income experiments. But I would say that for political reasons, like Richard was talking about the experiment they did and how it motivated the Indian politicians to push a basic income forward, that if people are thinking about it in a way, if policymakers are thinking about it in a way that's different from how I think about it, then experiments can be useful in support of that.
Right.
Now the problem is these experiments, they could go one way or they could go another way. Like if you picked a level of basic income and then your experiment shows that it's not worth the trade-off with something else because you're thinking about taxes or that kind of thing, and then you say no, basic income's a bad idea. That can't happen when you're taking my approach, where it's just about finding what the level of basic income is, rather than trying to impose something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess one thing that I was thinking about that you could learn from a micro basic income experiment isn't really about basic income, but you can see some of the short-term effects on different aspects of poverty. So for example, maybe even giving people a basic income for 1 year would get some people enough out of the paycheck to paycheck problem that they would have a buffer that then I don't know, maybe that effect would last the next 10 years, even if the basic income went away, because when they had a car, needed a car repair or needed to do something, they didn't have to do all these really expensive things that people do when they don't have any savings. So you could probably learn some interesting things about maybe even a short-term boost in people's income affecting kind of long-term
the only real way to
benefits or
test
something like
how
that.
short-term, long-term would be to stagger it. No basic income, 1 year basic income, 2 years basic income. You have a large.
Well, yeah, or you could even learn something if you just followed the people after these experiments and looked at some of that stuff too.
That's actually what happened in Africa and Ghana.
Oh, really?
Where they had they gave a basic income to people, and they also did a group that did apprenticeships and things like that, and then they followed afterwards for the next 10 years, and they showed that the basic income people did better, and that the apprenticeship people, they actually like many of them like sold their equipment and they gave up on their apprentice whatever skills they did.
Right. I mean, I guess there's this almost like, we've talked about this before, but there's kind of like I infer from things I hear that there's kind of like a blind spot, and I think it's in myself sometimes too, around other people's poverty, where it's like people just can't even realize how many benefits giving people money would have. Like they can finish their apprenticeship, or they can go to school, or they can, I don't even know, right? There's like a bunch of little benefits to having even a little bit more money when you're poor that people seem to be struck by when they're actually demonstrated. So I guess you're talking about rhetorically or whatever, just as a way to encourage people to give money, if there's a sense that somehow the people who don't have money, I don't know, are not going to use it well, or it's not going to really be that beneficial or whatever.
And certainly if we're incrementally moving toward a basic income from how things are, you can run experiments that say, hey, maybe it's actually better if we replace food stamps with direct cash transfers that people can spend any money on. So it's not a basic income, but now you're doing what you were doing before, except you're doing it more efficiently and more effectively.
Yeah.
So I think these kinds of experiments can be
useful. There's a weird psychological barrier to just giving people money as opposed to like conditional money that I guess some of this helps overcome. Yeah.
So basically you're talking about like reversing 1990s welfare reform as an experiment, because like we actually have that where like people are getting direct cash payment and that got substituted out for indirect, like specific aid during the 90s.
Right.
So like, the experiment like you're talking about there, we have the inverse of that already.
So I guess that's some more existing data that would be cool to look at.
Yeah, that's data. Even like it's 20 years old, but it's in the United States.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, 25 now probably, but
do you know anything about
before the 90s? It's like 30 years.
Yeah, it's
old.
early Clinton, like 94, I want to say. So
96.
96, okay.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I think so. That was first term Clinton.
Were you gonna say something, Bethany?
No, I guess I was going to speak to Nick's point a little bit. Like, one thing that I think it's really hard to learn from short-term basic income experiments is the effect on what people do with their employment. Because, like, if you anticipate that this is going to end in a year, even if your job is terrible, like, you can't really afford to leave it because, like, you need it again in a year just as much as you did before. So I think that's one of the limitations to a lot of these. Yeah.
There's also there's actually it could be seen that the cancellation of the Ontario experiment is useful because the people were planning for 3 years, and they only got 1. So you can see how that would affect them. How like I posted an article about how this woman was going back to school and how she's had to change all her plans so that because she doesn't have the resources to continue going to school.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
I was that while it's definitely true that like people can't make drastic changes necessarily if they're only expecting the basic income for a year. I wonder if, not that this is sort of really testable, but I wonder if they're still sort of on the margin. Like, okay, well, like I can imagine I could get a better job in less than a year, and so
that's
okay,
interesting.
I will quit my job now, knowing that I can live on this basic income, and so I will, apply, intentionally apply to other jobs, but like with less of a sense of urgency than if it was like, oh, I got fired and I'm on unemployment and I have to report to a recruiter. I could be like, okay, maybe I'll like talk to some folks and like wait a month before I quit my job.
Yeah, right. That's
like if you wanted to like transition into like a slightly different job, you could maybe be like, okay, I could like take some classes, and so then even when I'm not getting this basic income anymore, I could be like, okay, well maybe then I'll just get like a different kind of shitty job that will like pay my bills while I finish this retraining.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a good point. It like, especially if one were really concerned about the amount of money being spent, it might be really interesting to notice like these kinds of effects of even just like 1 year of giving people money. Because I agree, you're right. It might like on the margin you might be able to make a change, or these things that take like a little bit of buffer, like risks that take a little bit of buffer. I know that's not really like your general approach to basic income, so it's not as relevant, but.
Yeah, so I think a question we can ask is, what do we want from people? And a lot of these basic income experiments have these built-in assumptions of what would be good for people to do, like what would be good behavior, what would be bad behavior, what are positive outcomes from the basic income and what aren't. And a lot of those assumptions kind of stem from economic models, macroeconomic models that assume that we need everyone's labor as much as possible, or we need people to go to school, or there are various kind of expectations that are ingrained in our society that are tied into these economic models that maybe wouldn't apply in a world of basic income or apply as much. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
There actually are experiments for 1 year, like the Magnolia Mothers Trust in Mississippi is actually going to only go for 1 year.
Interesting.
And the Y Combinator is only supposed to go for 1 year. Well, they already had 1 year, but they haven't analyzed the data. And then there's going to be one that they're going to have another experiment. It's going to go in 2 states, but they haven't really announced when that's going to start or anything like that.
Yeah, I think they have 2 groups, one that receives it for a year maybe, and then another that receives it for 3 years, and they want to kind of compare the
So
results.
what kinds of things? So I think we've been establishing, like, you kind of need to know like what you're looking to test, and does your experiment actually test that thing? So what is something like Y Combinator looking to test? You know what I mean? That would, like, I'm wondering if they're failing. It seems like sometimes these experiments are also failing on the second thing. But I first need to know what they're.
I think they're testing.
I think that they're trying to alleviate their guilt about how automating everything away, and they're trying to level the different levels of, like, they're doing like $1,000 and $1,500 and like $2,000 or something like that.
But what's the DV? Like, what are they looking at as an outcome? What do they want to know, right?
So I think they're looking.
Sorry, I'm not attacking you. I'm just curious.
They're looking mostly at welfare outcomes of the recipients and also behavioral outcomes. Like, are they, does their behavior change in a way that they're doing more of the things we would want an upstanding citizen to do? So, like, getting education, or do they not quit their jobs? Like that kind of thing. So they're looking at both of these things.
Right. I think then that, like, I would add in again this concern about the temporary nature of it, because for some of those things it's valid to test it in a short term, like maybe the income and well-being. But again, I agree with your point about being on the margins, but it's still hard to estimate things like quitting your job when you know it's not last. Unless they're really looking at a short-term effect on.
So it might influence the magnitude of some of these effects. For sure, but in terms of seeing the effect at all, I think you would still see it if it's 1 year, 3 years. Like there would be some people who maybe would quit their job if it was guaranteed forever, and then there's some people who, or maybe those same people wouldn't quit their job if it's only for 3 years.
Right.
But then there are other people who would quit their job either way and kind of figure it. Like I think you'd still see the effects. Right. It would just be.
Yeah, but then I'm trying to think, what are they looking for? Since you can't really tell the quantity in a very interesting way. So is it just a question of, do you see anybody quit their job?
Right.
Like, what is your hypothesis there?
So this is a good segue into the next quote, but first we'll go to Richard.
There's also Give Directly in Kenya that's doing a basic income for 12 years.
Oh, that's really cool. That's
and they already have like basic data. Like there's these people who like frittered away doing stupid things, like releasing a karaoke CD or something like that, and other people who like
maybe that was really smart.
Yeah, maybe that was
great.
Actually,
some people like running away with the money that were supposed to be for the karaoke CD, and then there's other people who they're by this, like, I think it's like Lake Victoria or something like that, and they didn't have the money to create fishing nets before, and so they use the basic income to create fishing nets, and then they sell all the fish and they increase their income drastically.
Cool.
So NPR did a thing about that, and basically you basically see the whole spectrum. But the most interesting thing that they saw that was like more you wouldn't necessarily expect it is a lot of people in some villages like would just buy new roofs for their houses. So they had thatch roofs, and they would buy like a metal roof.
I think I've heard about this.
Or stuff like that, where it's like a very clear one-time purchase. They spend all of it on that. It's not.
Did they get all the money at one time?
They get $1,000 a year, I believe.
Oh, they get it per year.
Is it lump sum a year?
Yeah, it's a lump sum every year, and it's actually because
weird.
mobile payments are huge in Africa, way bigger than, and they were they've always been the biggest in Africa. 'Cause they don't have a
Right.
lot of cash, especially in like rural places.
Right.
They have mobile phone accounts where they send it through
Right.
SMS.
Right.
So-
M-Pesa.
Yeah.
Huh.
So
That's interesting.
And they also have these merry-go-round groups where everyone go. They have a group of like 6 people, and then each month everyone pools the money together, and 6 people's money together, and then they'll have enough to purchase a metal roof for.
Interesting.
everybody gets it one time, so they lottery off. It's effectively a lottery, but everybody always gets the money.
Right.
So they rotate who gets the money each
Yeah,
month.
like the most common are 6 or 12 people, and it's like
Right.
you have to put it in every month, but then at the end of it, like your whatever month you are, you get all the money that month.
Interesting. So I guess this is really interesting, and it could be something maybe you'd want to experiment on, which is that there's these different benefits. I can see benefits of giving like big lump sums at a time because you can make these life-changing purchases. But I also see the downside, which is like frittering it away or whatever is like much more likely if you get a big lump sum at once versus like if it's a continuous stream, then you're always going to have like some money for food first. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting. I don't really know which is better, but.
So a question we might ask is, so for the people who bought those metal roofs and they were getting the basic income in a lump sum once a year, do we think they would have been better off with a daily basic income, like the same amount of money but spread out over the course of the year, or do we think they're better off with a lump sum?
So the interesting thing about most of the people receiving this is they're subsistence farmers. So they buy and they can trade their food for everything they need to go day to day.
Oh, I see.
So the lump sum, like they own their homes, they farm
Right.
for their food, they sell
That's
some of the
interesting.
food, they buy their clothes with that, but they don't have much else extra.
Right.
So giving it the lump sum is a lot more meaningful and impactful for them because they can make those investments.
Right. And they actually aren't worrying about like food day to day as much.
No, not as
Right.
much. Not
That's
with these
interesting.
groups.
So we think that if we gave it to them daily, they would not they would not save it up and buy the metal roof,
Right.
and they'd end up being
Best case
more
scenario, they
They
have to wait a
might,
year for
yeah.
the metal roof when they could have just had it originally.
We could just start the basic income a year earlier.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah.
But saving it like that is harder probably than,
Yeah.
I don't know.
So it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know.
It's interesting. Yeah.
How
it's
would
interesting.
how would their lives have changed if they had the basic income daily?
So in Africa, they probably don't have like a well-functioning credit granting system, I'm guessing. I don't know, maybe they do.
It depends on the country.
In this area? In this area specifically?
Oh, in these parts, not that I would imagine. I mean, when you have rural communities, they're pretty spread out.
Right. I would
Even
think,
in the U.S., you don't have as much
Right.
access to credit.
Because I guess I was just thinking like one way to have your cake and eat it too a little bit could be that you have the basic income be gradual, but because credit granting agencies know that people have this basic income, people are pretty credit worthy, and so if they want to make a larger purchase, they can just take out a loan.
So you can borrow money and pay for the roof. Yeah.
The reason that there isn't a lot of credit in a lot of parts of Africa is actually because of hyperinflation and other issues like that.
I see. Right. Yeah.
So
it's hard to set the terms of the loan.
Yeah.
Right.
It's very hard to do that.
So that would be maybe more appropriate to think about how you'd handle these different pros and cons in a place like the United States or something like that.
If you're giving the basic income in dollars, you could set the terms of the loan in dollars.
That's
because
true.
you know they're getting a dollar basic income.
That's true.
Yeah, that's actually caused a lot of problems for people. I mean, yes, if you're getting the basic, but then they have to spend the money in the local currency generally, so then they have to convert it themselves.
Well, you can still have the contracts denominated in dollars and still pay them in local currency. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but then if there's, I understand what you're saying, but this is a huge problem in Turkey with hyperinflation, where the contracts for loans are denominated in euros most commonly, and so as things start to adjust, even if you make money in euros, you have to transfer some of the money to the local currency. You can't do it it becomes a mess.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, that is a thing of last resort, and it doesn't necessarily help that much in most economies.
So you don't imagine that if people were receiving a daily basic income in, I guess, Kenya, or where the give directly, is it Kenya, Uganda?
I want to say it's Kenya.
It's in Kenya.
Kenya. Yeah. So if people were receiving the daily basic income in Kenya instead of the yearly basic income, you imagine that the credit market would not emerge, that these kind of inefficiencies would get in the way so much that
I think that you would see a lot of the money lost to these markets. People might do it, but the interest rate they would have to charge because they want to make sure that they end up in the benefit would be so much that it would be you're giving the person $1,000, but the interest that they would get on this loan if they were to take it out might eat up $200 of that.
You don't imagine that they would that a dollar-denominated credit market would emerge?
I mean, maybe, but that does cause problems in itself.
Yeah.
Like, there really are translational errors there, basically, between currencies when you do that, and it really does cause some problems when that's happened before. Like on a business-to-business level, it generally works out fine, but on an individual level, Greece had that problem when they converted to, before the euro. Turkey's had that problem. Several other countries have had that problem, and you wouldn't necessarily want to, potentially create that whirlpool.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess.
But I think I don't know if you're moving on from it, but I think one of the big focuses of Give Directly is on treating it like an experiment and and doing follow up and doing like random controlled trials.
They go into a village and they give it to half the people, not the other. Like that's one of the things they've done.
They've done that,
but then I think they decided that didn't work out so well. And now they choose a village and they give it to everybody in this village.
Right.
But then they still compare it to the village next door.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And it's interesting to me. We've talked about this before, but like it's kind of interesting that the baseline for what to do with charitable giving isn't to give directly, like in terms of what people's mindset is. You might think that would be your baseline, and if you're going to do something different, you have to think about why it's better than just letting people choose how to spend the money themselves. Like maybe you have a special resource, you can do it more efficiently or something like that. Instead, it's like this pretty radical idea that Give Directly has done a lot of work to like experiment on, I think partly to demonstrate to people that it actually works and it's not a failure and stuff. So it's just interesting to me that they are almost in that like kind of defensive position. At least they started out that way.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
They also look into the opinions of those villages that don't get it, and then the ones that are next door, and they say that they're happy that the other village that actually gets it because they get hired as laborers to fix the roofs and things like that.
So they can sell things to the other village, including their services.
Right. So this is like the economic stimulus argument that you make. Yeah. It's unleashing productive capacity that has been untapped.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I also wanted to give you a shout out just real quick because you talk a lot about we mention a lot that governments need to keep prices stable. And this is just like your conversation is just like a good example of missed opportunities and problems that happen when a government can't keep its prices stable, including less obvious things like people can't be extended credit even when they're credit worthy very easily because you don't know what's the price of. And it's just an interesting point.
Go ahead, David.
So the one thing I wanted to throw in there in like a very similar vein to the Give Directly kind of charitable thing is there was an experiment run out of Yale, I want to say, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where they basically created a insurance program for farmers. And what they saw was the productive capacity of these farmers increased significantly when they were able to buy very cheap insurance. And most people didn't need it. Like the insurance program still did okay, even though it was subsidized. But fundamentally what happened was farmers wouldn't plant as much because they'd be worried about, I don't want
what
to
if you can't sell it?
Yeah, what if I can't sell it, or for what if it rains too much or doesn't rain enough, and et cetera, et cetera. So, they increased this, they said, whatever you plant, we'll cover the cost of your seed plus, twice as much or whatever it is.
Right.
So farmers, went ahead and they planted a lot more. They were very much more productive for the year or two that it ran. Some bad things happened, so the insurance program ended up shutting down, unfortunately, but...
So this is also what futures markets are for, right? Hedging against,
But I mean, they're not developed there.
I see.
Yeah, like insurance wasn't developed there before this program came in.
And where were they doing it?
I believe Nigeria, I want to say.
All right.
So
the farmers aren't trading on futures.
I know, that's why I was Googling. I was like, wait, is this Ghana? Is that what the NPR article is about?
Is that Ghana?
I thought it was the United States too.
I knew it was somewhere, and the United States actually has a program for that, and actually the World Trade Organization, that we've been sued over it. We actually have to pay other countries money. If Brazil, we have to pay $50 million a year to.
Wait, why?
Because we subsidize our farm insurance in the United States.
Why did we have to pay other countries because of that?
World Trade Organization rules.
Oh, because they're less competitive as a result, or something.
We are more competitive.
We're more competitive.
We're subsidizing our farmers basically, so we have to pay other countries money for it.
That seems odd. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
because there's many factors that lead labor to be more or less expensive in different countries. I guess I don't know a lot about the World Trade Organization.
It's just probably a weird quirk of how the agreements.
Yeah, it's like we have to pay some country in Southeast Asia like $20 million a year because we won't sell, like, we have rules on importing clove cigarettes here that are against WTO rules.
Or like what you said before, how the books in that one island, they don't have to pay royalties or anything like that, so they just print them out. Oh.
I know what you're talking about.
Oh,
I may have said something I don't recall, Richard. Sorry.
Fair enough.
But yeah, so I mean, it was gone apparently, but it was out of Yale, I believe.
Yeah, it was at a Yale. So like Dean Carlin and folks. I'm skipping this NPR thing, and I was like, "Oh, Dean Carlin, I know him because he works with JPL." And
Okay.
yeah, it's like a transcript of an interview,
Yeah.
so it's hard to sort of skip.
Yeah, but like basically they ran for a couple of years. It was like weirdly successful, and it's because you set a baseline of income for these farmers.
Right.
So again, like it's targeted at a group, but it actually increased the protective capacity of this group when you introduce this floor.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
it's like northern Ghana where it's very dry and very rural. They sent them like the equivalent of $250, and there was no rules put on it. So that was like the money group, and there was a risk group, and so that was where they gave them insurance.
Interesting.
Which group won in terms of outcomes?
Unclear. I mean, I assume that David maybe remembers. I am skimming this very long.
I just remember that
interview.
the farmers who got the insurance program ended up having a much higher capacity,
Right.
which increased their income generally.
Right.
So I think the net of it was that they were like it was actually the results may have been inconclusive. I don't remember a clear distinction between the two of them. I don't know if I heard that interview or where I read about it otherwise, but I don't remember them coming to a conclusion, or I don't remember what the conclusion is. Sorry.
Cool.
Interesting.
Yeah, so let's move on to the next quote. There are two broad classes of economic models, theoretical and empirical. Theoretical models seek to derive verifiable implications about economic behavior under the assumption that the agents maximize specific objectives subject to constraints that are well defined in the model, for example, an agent's budget. They provide qualitative answers to specific questions, such as the implications of asymmetric information when one side to a transaction knows more than the other, or how best to handle market failures. In contrast, empirical models aim to verify the qualitative predictions of theoretical models
Oh, really?
and to convert these predictions to precise numerical outcomes.
Huh.
For example, a theoretical model of an agent's consumption behavior would generally suggest a positive relationship between expenditure and income. The empirical adaptation of the theoretical model would attempt to assign a numerical value to the average amount of expenditure increases when income increases. So this is like the difference between giving people money will cause them to work less and having
Giving them $1,000 a month will cause 20% of people to quit their jobs.
right, having some kind of relationship between how much money you give them and how much less they're working and that kind of thing.
Right. Cool.
So I think a lot of the basic income experiments out there are doing this more empirical model kind of stuff.
They are?
Well, yeah. I mean, you're saying they're saying we're going to give basic income to this group of people, and then what's the percentage drop in employment? That. Kind of
well,
thing.
they're testing that, but do they have an a priori prediction about it?
Well, I guess they're developing empirical models.
Oh, so let me ask a question
yeah.
about empirical models. When you were describing this, I was imagining that the empirical model is all a priori. Like they're taking somehow the theoretical model and just making it more precise based on I don't know what to figure out exactly how the empiric should work out, and then they go and test that. But it sounds from what you're saying like sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's basically just describing what's already happened empirically, which I wouldn't usually call a model, but I guess I'm wondering which one of those it is.
I guess the model is developed empirically based on empirical data. So
So kind of like machine learning, like you feed yourself some data, and then you predict it on some new data.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. If you just train on a data set and then you have some hypothetical new data, you can make predictions based on like other things and then you've built a model, you've built an empirical model.
Right, because the theoretical model doesn't necessarily specify the empirics, right?
The theoretical model is the theory that certain things will happen when other things happen.
Right, but you don't know how much.
But you don't know how the size of the effect, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then The empirical model is you're developing kind of quantitative predictions of the size of various effects. And this, of course, can get tricky because if you've got two theoretical models that say two different things will happen and you don't know the magnitudes of them, then the outcome can be completely different depending on kind of which one wins out, if they're like both competing in opposite directions for a similar effect or something like that.
Like, can you explain more?
So if you've got a model that says if, so here's a good one that relates to basic income. If you've got a model that says people receiving basic income will work less, but then you've also got a model that says people spending more money will create more jobs in the economy. What should our prediction be about the change in the amount of labor being performed? So it depends on the magnitude of these two kind of competing effects.
Right.
Right.
You could probably figure out relationships, like if maybe I would think about it, like if X is greater than Y, then you'll get a general drop in if this is greater than that.
Right. So that could be part of your theoretical model, and then empirically you can't know until you do the empirical study which direction it's actually going to go.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Like on a really standard, like very basic level, going back to like my roof example, if you just gave everybody a roof, it takes a day to put up a roof, it takes 2 people to put up a roof. So every person you gave a roof to would create, 1/2 of 1 day's labor effectively.
Right.
But like it's that extrapolated over the entire economy, and Alex could spend his money on a new phone and I could spend my money on whatever the heck I want to,
Right.
quite frankly, and you have no idea like what the translation of
course.
labor versus
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And like
Right.
things might get more automated, or
Yeah.
like it's kind of, there's so many different consequences.
That's like how charities, how they're actually comparing, giving out in-kind things like mosquito nets or water purification things versus giving out money, and they're showing that giving out money is much better than giving out in-kind things typically.
That makes sense. Although I might imagine exceptions, like if you in that country don't have access to really efficiently produced, inexpensive malaria nets, but the charity can have access to those. You see what I mean? Then it could be a lot more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are specific examples of specific in-kind things being really,
I think
really
malaria
effective.
nets are actually one of those.
And I think malaria nets, at least in some places, are one example of something where the in-kind is gonna win. But you have to demonstrate that. I mean, I think your standard should still be like, is this better than giving people money?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying before, right? Like you have that as a baseline, and then
giving out grain distorts the market. And causes the farmers not to produce things as much.
That's actually one of the problems with food aid. Is a general rule in countries, direct food aid is
interesting.
It provides less incentive for local growth agriculture.
Right. And you say that's a problem, and I might say, that's great. They don't have to grow their own food anymore. We can just keep sending them food, and we have the capacity to do that.
Right. Because sometimes when I think when I see like videos and think about like the conditions under which certain people are farming, like it's so dramatically inefficient. It takes up all of their time. It does kind of seem like mass producing the food and then sending it to people. Or sending them the money even better is
sending the money
an optimal way.
We have
because then they can choose to purchase grain from us if that's what they
anywhere
want.
they want.
That's what we do with weapons.
Exactly.
So.
Only.
And we have 4 billion pounds of processed cheese just sitting there, not doing anything, and so we could just ship it to Kenya or something.
They might not want it.
Probably don't.
I'd rather
probably a
go
reason why
hungry.
it's sitting there.
For the record, Kenya was a more recent farm experiment in 2016. I was conflating the two.
That's
but I was looking that up, and I was like, they've done it in multiple places. Apparently, they did pay out last year also for the insurance.
Oh man.
So I just wanted to, since we were bringing up the example of the effects on labor and how like basic income can affect it in different ways depending on the magnitude of different effects. Again, like a lot of these complexities, I feel like are irrelevant. If what you care about is the amount of labor, then you have to know all this stuff.
Right.
But if what you care about is just getting basic income to a level where people can buy what they can maximally buy, then it's kind of an irrelevant question, and we can have a simpler theoretical model that that doesn't need to be kind of picked apart empirically as much. If that makes sense.
If you're lucky enough that what you care about is easier to predict from a simple theoretical model.
Yeah, and I think basic income is an example where what we should care about is very simple. Yeah.
So I do want to talk about this whole thing as a whole, based on other things we've talked about with the impact of this in financial modeling and et cetera.
Right.
So everybody gets $1,000. I'm gonna go buy a roof for it. I want to hire Alex to put my roof on. Alex also has $1,000. All of a sudden, he doesn't want my $5 I was going to offer him to help put my roof on anymore. He wants $20, or it's not worth it to him.
Right.
That's inflation.
Yeah.
And the real impact of that is real inflation. We've had other conversations about inflation before, but that does impact a lot of things with modeling. And the more inflation there is from that kind of thing, the more it costs to borrow. So that if I was paid out over a slower period, then it's harder to get that loan to put on the roof. And
So I think the key insight to keep in mind is that any price level is a redenomination of any other price level. What matters is changes in the price level. What matters is the actual effect of inflation. But what we can know is that at any kind of output level in the economy, it can correspond with any given price level. So the idea with basic income would be to boost the output level, but you'd still want to keep the price level where it originally was for a smoother transition. So you wouldn't. So if your basic income is so high that it's causing generalized inflation in the economy, then what's going to happen is prices are going to keep going up and up and up until you get to the point where consumer purchasing power is now in line with the productive capacity of the economy again, and now prices will stabilize, and your new price level is just a redenomination of the old price level. But you want to pick the basic income that doesn't cause that change to happen.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I'm just going back and rehashing the whole thing and being able to model that out. I don't know what the impact of that is. I think
that's why Alex would, from his model, would not be able to pick the amount, because he doesn't know whether $1,000, for example, is going to cause generalized inflation or not.
Which you don't know what the multiplier is. You don't know.
Which is why, his general pragmatic approach is to start very small and increase gradually, I guess.
Right, and do it algorithmically, and then eventually you get to a point where we reach kind of the limits of monetary policy and in preventing inflation, and then the economy is kind of at capacity. It's producing at the limit of what it can produce.
Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
No, this is going in a circle. I'm just saying, I do think that actual labor would, you can't automate everything. Actual labor would continue to rise no matter what every time you raised it, and that would create some extra inflation.
I think Alex has sometimes argued that it's unclear because some people might be willing to do things for cheaper.
Well,
enjoyable stuff.
Some people might be able to.
So labor is, there's a few things. So labor is not the only resource in the economy. So if something's very labor intensive now, and basic income disincentivizes people from doing that work for that cheap, that product might become less labor intensive because you might start substituting other resources, technologies, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, will wages go up or go down under a basic income? I think this is one of those things we'd have to figure out empirically, because you have kind of you have a few different competing effects. So one effect is that people don't need the money as desperately anymore. And they already have enough money, so you might have to pay them more to get them to sacrifice their leisure time, that kind of thing. And then another effect is that there's work that people would want to do, but they can't because they can't afford to right now because it doesn't allow them to survive. Now with the basic income, they can afford to do the work they want to do for cheaper. They don't have to hold out for something that pays them enough. So that can be downward pressure on labor prices. So it's not clear to me what the net effect is going to be on labor prices when you introduce a basic income, but just also factoring in that even if we figured out that net effect through some kind of modeling or something like that, that's not the price of labor is only one price in the economy, and there's other resources. So I think taking a more top-down approach of saying, okay, we want to keep price levels stable. We gradually increase consumer spending until we tap out the productive capacity of the economy, while keeping the price level consistent. No inflation, no deflation. I think that's the simplest approach.
Yeah, I'm just saying it'd be really hard to model for that.
Oh yeah.
Like really, I'm just interjecting. I really don't know how you would control for that in a model, because I agree with you. But I think that what you would see is some specialized and skillful labor that is in demand would skyrocket effectively.
Yeah, some prices are going to go up and some prices are going to go down. There are some you can predict. Like I would imagine that the price of meat would go up a lot because people would start being able to spend more money on food. So now,
that's what's happening in China and in South America.
Internationally, you're talking about, not just in the United States, because in the United States, our meat is already relatively very cheap.
Yeah, I would say globally. Yeah. If you had but meat is this kind of this scarce thing that not everyone can afford, and giving people more money isn't going to magically cause us to produce more meat because it's very resource intensive, and we're kind of like towards the limit of how much meat we can produce without sacrificing other things.
Especially if you consider sustainability and environmental stuff.
Yeah, so if you had a global basic income, food might stay just as cheap as it is now, but meat itself might become more of a luxury than we think of it. I mean, it's already a luxury for everyone else, but it might start being more of a luxury for people in America because now people elsewhere are able to buy meat, that kind of thing.
I also would think that the price of artificial meats would go down pretty significantly because there'd be a higher demand for them, which may counterbalance that to some degree.
Yeah, that's right. I think he was just talking about non-artificial.
Yeah. But I know, but I'm just saying it's two different inputs.
Right, exactly. So it is really hard. I mean, you can make guesses. I think if we were to guess like which of these two jobs is likely to have the wage go down, garbage collector or yoga teacher. Like we could probably all make a good guess. Like yoga teacher probably more likely to go down because more people enjoy it and already maybe do it without making that much of a living off of it. Like I don't know if garbage collector is actually an unpleasant job, but let's just like assume, right?
Let's assume.
I haven't done it. Maybe it's relaxing once you. Yeah, but
it's very zen actually.
Well, your sense of smell adapts within like 15 minutes, so it's probably actually not as bad as we imagine it to be. But anyway, so
you're smelling different people's garbage. There's different.
That's true. That's a good point. That's a good point. Maybe it doesn't really work. I'm just saying, like, I totally agree with you that it's very hard to model. Like, we could probably make some educated guesses on the details, but overall, like, it's hard. Yeah.
Good thing we don't need to.
This is maybe getting off the topic, but the question it raises for me is, and this is, I guess, specifically for you, Alex. Like, it's a question about the model that you tend to be advocating. If I understand it correctly, you're saying that there's some maximum basic income that we could, that you could transition to that corresponds to closing the gap between the production now and the productive capacity.
Right.
And productive capacity can also change, but and we don't know what that is. We don't really know how big that gap is. We've been talking about there are these like very complicated feedbacks that we can't model.
Right.
And so it makes sense to kind of gradually ramp it up until you got there.
Yep.
What if you did that and the result was that basic income was like less than our optimistic version of this is?
Yeah.
Then you would still have the option of increasing it more if you did get the money from somewhere else. Like if you did take the money away from something else.
Not if you got the money from somewhere else, but if you figured out a way to free up resources in the economy. So if you just taken the money, so if you take money from Bill Gates, he wasn't spending that money on consumer goods, right?
Okay, but that's a very extreme case, right? I mean, what if you're taking it from, I don't know, high-paid lawyers or something. Like
Right.
those guys are spending it
Well,
on
again,
Teslas.
it
and
depends on what they're buying.
hot
So
tubs.
you'd need to reduce the resource usage of the lawyers by the same amount that you're increasing the resource usage of the consumers who are receiving the basic income. So the amount of money might not line up at all. It's the amount of resources that you're
So I
freeing
think
up that
what's
matters.
valuable in this perspective is like it could be more efficient. So rather than saying like let's get the money, you'd say like okay, we really need to get resources. So like where are there a lot of resources being used
Or being
up
wasted.
or being wasted
Yeah.
that we would like to have go to consumers, especially lower income consumers, and maybe that would end up with a tax, but it might be like a more targeted tax on those specific things, or something that's going to more maximally impact resources as efficiently as possible.
Tax wasteful spending or wasteful behavior, that
So
kind of
luxury
thing.
tax is basically what you're at.
Well, you might not
Well,
need to
it depends.
tax like massages or something like that because like maybe that's not really, unless the labor is really valuable. You'd have to decide like what is the constraining resource.
Right, there are
that,
luxuries
you know,
that don't really use up any resources.
No, it's
Right.
like in the past there's been like yacht taxes, and for example,
Right.
like it's a very specific tax on a very specific item that is being considered
Right.
a luxury. Like during
Right.
World War II, I think there was a yacht
Yeah.
tax because it's
So-
like, well, these naval resources can be better spent
Right.
for the Navy.
Yes.
So I think exactly.
makes
So,
a
I
lot of
think
sense,
Alex's like optimal team of economists would look at like where are the bottlenecks in the economy? Like why are we not able to produce more? Maybe it's even a specific resource like wood or something, and then they would like go and target those bottlenecks through specific taxes
Right.
or something like that, and then see how much you can increase the basic income then, and then like do it again and do it again until you're
Right.
feeling.
But I still wouldn't frame it as getting the money from somewhere.
Does that make
Okay, I mean that's one.
That's
that
what you
would
would
be
think
one
about it.
way to do it, right?
Right.
But I mean, and maybe it's sort of more optimal or more efficient. But a more maybe straightforward way, or a way that's more familiar to people,
Mhm.
would be just with like an income tax.
Right.
Yeah, so I would say that that's a way that's familiar to people, but it also does not work at all. It just doesn't work. The fact that it looks like it works, the fact that we're able to give consumers money and they're able to buy stuff, means that we could have done
But
that
can
probably
you?
with or
I think
without
you
the
need to
income tax.
explain that more to Nick, because I think like what Nick is saying is like some of the money you're taking from the people with the income tax was going towards resources, so it's just like it should have some benefit. But I think
it's yeah.
if I were going to guess for Alex, I think he might say the problem is some of the productive capacity might also be decreased at the same time because it's such a diffuse tax, and you might be disincentivizing certain kinds of behaviors or like certain kinds of investments.
Yeah.
Is that part of the problem?
I think it gets really complicated. It gets to this whole like theoretical model where all these different things are pushing in different directions, and you don't know what the overall effect is going to be, and that kind of thing. The income tax itself, it's hard to say whether it would increase or decrease the amount of basic income we could afford. It's not as obvious as the VAT tax, which is a straight tax on production, but it's similar. It's a tax on labor, which is one of the inputs to production. Go ahead, Richard.
Does that make sense? So it's not just neutral, and it's got
Right.
like this.
Actually,
negative
Elizabeth
side.
Warren, this a few days ago, proposed a wealth tax like Charlie was talking about.
Yeah.
It's like 2% for people with under $50 million, I think it is, and then 3% more, or 3% for billionaires, and so it would take a percentage of their entire wealth each year.
People would just hide their wealth overseas.
That's what they already do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. But even if you could,
And people who like renounce their citizenship would have a 40% exit tax.
They already have that. That's actually a thing.
yeah, it's really, yeah. So I mean, even if you could implement something like this successfully, like put down a wealth tax and figure out a way to get everyone to pay it without hiding their wealth offshore, et cetera, it doesn't actually allow the government to spend more money in terms of the resource constraints that spending would go to purchase.
Alex, I mean, just
Yeah.
politically it allows them to basically spend the money, right?
Politically, because they're trying to balance their budget, they can do it. So if you're a government and you're trying to balance your budget, then yeah, you can use income tax to fund basic income. You can use VAT. You can
Right.
use wealth tax. But ultimately, what's constraining the basic income is the productive capacity of the economy. And if you didn't have that productive capacity ahead of time, then the income tax, wealth tax, VAT tax, none of those are going to magically create that capacity for you.
Okay, wait. Okay. I'm not totally convinced. What if let's imagine we live in kind of a Star Trek world where everything you use comes out of a replicator.
Nice.
Right?
Yes.
But the replicator uses a lot of electricity. So basically everyone is limited by their electricity bill.
Right.
Like how high an electricity bill can you afford?
Mm-hmm.
And then in that situation, it seems like an income tax would directly reduce the amount of electricity that
Right.
rich lawyers could afford to spend on replicating tons of...
But I think you've created a world where dollar per resource is a fixed ratio for everybody, and it's always the same, which is exactly what he's saying is like not the case.
So I would say that even in this world, there's a difference between the amount of electricity that the lawyer could buy and the amount of the electricity the lawyer does buy. So if the lawyer is really, really, really rich, and he's already replicating all the stuff he needs, then maybe he's got his replicator that he feeds cash when he needs to buy the electricity. Then he's also got a pile of cash that's accumulating over here that's not using up any electricity. So taking from that pile of cash, his wealth, is not going to free up electricity for poor people, right? Because it wasn't using any electricity to begin with. Does that make sense?
Right. So I guess that's kind of an empirical question, like to what extent are higher income people using proportionally more.
Well, we know that a lot of
proportionally higher fraction of the productive capacity. of the economy.
Right. And we know that when you have more money, there's a lower marginal propensity to consume. Like we've empirically tested this. We know that, rich people, they spend a lower proportion of their money, and then the money they do spend goes towards luxury items that are really, really expensive, but maybe took the same amount of resources as a regular consumer item. Like you buy a luxury car that costs 4 times as much, but it doesn't have more metal in it or something like that. But I think we don't really need to know this to be able to look at resources that are being used in the economy or wasted in the economy that we want to free up and target the resources instead of targeting the people. And it could be, obviously, if the poor people are the ones using those resources, then we don't want to target that. But, if a lot of resources are being used up, like we see they're being used up by rich people, we can target that spending. But if a rich person wants to say, I want to show off that I'm rich, so I'm, burning a pile of cash or something like that, we don't need to tax that. That's spending that's not going toward any resources. You know what I mean? Or buying a $10,000 bottle of champagne. That's not something you need to tax because it's just still one bottle of champagne of resources.
We actually already had a discussion on this for futures. Our discussion of
we did talk about replicators
or something like that
with
replicators.
Really?
We did talk about replicators.
It took us. It was a sinister twist on it, though. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you want to watch the video, the future was the topic. It was in August or sometime around then.
I don't remember this. I must not have been here.
I was here.
Yes, you
might
were.
have been.
Yeah, I feel like it went very dark.
But I think actually, Nick, not to belabor this too much, but I think hidden or not hidden in your analogy actually is partly the difference between the way that Alex feels the economy works and what people intuitively feel. So in addition to the money that's just piling up, you also have this one-to-one relationship between dollars and resource use because you've constructed a world in which there's only one resource. Every dollar is going to it equally, right? And so that's really different from the world that we actually live in.
But it's really, even then, it's still a relationship between spending and resource usage,
right? Spending,
and not a relationship between income and resource usage, and not a relationship between wealth and resource usage.
Right, it's more about the spending.
But even the spending, when rich people spend, they're using fewer resources because they're paying more for the luxury
fewer
versions
per dollar.
of things. Yeah.
Not fewer in aggregate, but fewer per dollar.
Fewer per dollar, yeah.
Well, okay, but what? All right, maybe this reduces to the same thing. But what if let's take the example of meat,
Mm-hmm.
right? Let's say meat prices really start inflating as you roll out the basic income.
Sure.
And then what we agree is that what's really important in quality of life is how much meat you can eat.
Right.
And so what we really need to do is somehow address this by figuring out some way to make it fairer and redistribute access to meat eating.
Yeah.
Right.
So you could have like a progressive tax on meat or meat rationing or
it says that
Go
it
ahead, Richard.
incentivizes lab-grown meat. Like,
yeah, that's how you.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but
Mhm.
but
Not
given
everyone really thinks that that's meat, though.
I mean, that's
It
that's
actually-
something for here and there.
for the people who
It
do
is
think that's
hypothetical
meat,
in which,
they
like,
can get
really from
they can
a
get really
cow
cheap meat,
is
and then so even
I thought
though
I thought it was really
As a
expensive.
vegetarian.
Now
really
we're
expensive
saying
right
there would
now.
be downward
Right.
pressure on the because it's just not scaled.
if meat gets so expensive that it's more expensive than the lab grown meat,
Yeah.
then that actually increases
Right.
capacity for lab grown meat and drives
Yeah.
the price down even further.
Right.
Um,
I think I
But-
think I understand your point, Nick, and I think the question would be like if that's for a very small minority of goods, then you probably just want to like target those goods, like with some way to redistribute those goods. You see what I mean? If that's how we kind of feel about most items in the economy, that they're getting really expensive, well then now we're into like inflation, which is something
So
that Alex is trying to
you
avoid.
can't fix the meat problem by increasing the basic income or increasing the taxes on the wealthy, because they're still going to be more wealthy, so they're
Right.
still going to be the ones getting the meat, right? If you really need everyone to have a tiny portion of meat, then you got to do that some other way.
Yeah, like it becomes a public utility, and in addition to water and whatever, you get like your meat delivery, and everyone gets the same.
Right, or there
or
could just
something.
there could just be like a meat tracking thing in your
Right.
basic income or in your bank account or something that tracks how much meat you buy.
You're
and
only allowed to buy so much.
either you're only allowed to buy so much, or the tax on the meat increases exponentially or
Oh,
something
there
like
you
that.
go.
Or you can
water.
have or you can
Yeah,
have like
that's
rationing in like World War II,
Right,
or you
right.
can trade your meat coupons
Mhm.
for someone else's coupons or their money or something, and then you can.
Yeah, you can sell them. I would sell my meat coop. Like if
Me
this is
too.
like the
And that-
most rare
and right,
resource
that's
ever.
I would 100%.
That's actually
Yeah.
way more efficient than rationing out the meat directly, because
Yeah,
not
I
everybody
mean-
wants it equally, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
But I
right.
mean, isn't the idea of living in a market
Yeah.
that the market kind of that somehow effectively dollars stand for the average thing, right?
Yes.
I mean, it like
But I think
it's
you've
electricity. It's
You've
If we-
constructed
it's-
something kind of specific, right? Which is that like there's a very rare and constrained resource, but we also think it's like critical for everybody's well-being. But it's critical even if you can only have a small fraction of it, right? Which is like a whole kind of specific scenario that I think
Like even with
the market
electricity,
doesn't.
somebody's gonna go live off the grid. Like there are gonna be people who are like, no, I don't need electricity in my life, and I'm gonna go live somewhere where there's no electricity. Like there's no
replicators
one
are bad. You should have a
Yeah.
vegetable garden.
I mean,
Yeah.
you wouldn't want to be doing this with too many goods, or like you said, you've lost like a lot of the benefits of a market. But I also feel like in reality, like not that many goods.
You're going to do it for any
Yes.
good where you construct a scenario where everyone should have an exact tiny proportion minimum amount of it or something like that, and it's limited in that way.
You can't scale up its production.
It's
that
you
much
can't
more,
you can't
like-
kind of solve this through the market without constraining the market in some way.
So, what do you think? I'm motivated partly because
Yeah.
your picture of this is,
Yeah.
is a outlier compared to most other, the mainstream of the discourse about
Basic income.
basic income.
Yeah.
I brought this book because I remembered I read this over the summer. It's called Basic Income: A Radical Proposal for a Free Society and Sane Economy, and it has a section on econometric models
Oh, cool.
that I was wanting to refresh my memory on the bus on the way down here. And but this book is not interesting if you take Alex's view, which is that you don't have to pay for a basic income with taxes, right? Like
Right.
everything in here like starts from there,
Right.
and it's like a whole bunch of interesting chapters, but it's all
Right.
assuming that.
I think there's
Like
kind
most
of like
people do,
I think
and-
there's kind of like two, oh, go ahead. Sorry. didn't
So
mean to
I don't know.
yeah.
I'm really interested in trying to understand sort of
Right.
how to where do these two viewpoints match up, and it,
So one of them is wrong. So in terms of kind of what you said, I think the connecting point is a dollar representing like an average unit of stuff,
yeah.
or a claim on being able to buy an average thing. So with the example with meat, if meat is really scarce and there's only a certain amount of it, then we're probably not going to be thinking of meat as an average thing anymore. Now, you constructed a scenario in which everyone does need a tiny amount of meat or something like that, and that's kind of like a very special case. But if you increase the amount of basic income beyond, actually, let me back up a second. So it is true that each dollar represents an average thing, but it's not like there's an average thing out there's not like there's some good out there corresponding to every dollar that someone's holding or some unit of production. It's more that the spending in the economy has to line up with the production in the economy. So the piles of cash don't fit in very well, and then you're still taking an average. So rich people spending, even though it could go to buying regular consumer goods that everyone would ordinarily want to buy. Like, their dollars are the same as everyone else's dollars, but they don't spend them in the same way. They don't use them the same way. Does that make sense?
So less of it is going towards that flow of spending that we're matching with the flow of production.
Right, exactly.
Right. So there's like a flow of spending that we're matching with the flow of production that's really important. Production of average goods.
The consumer spending has to line up with the economy's production in order to keep prices stable. Yeah. Now, in terms of the taxing, I think it comes from the intuition that each dollar is equivalent, and you can move $1 from one place to another. And the intuition is right, but only to a point. It's right that each dollar could be used equivalently to every other dollar, but by taking a dollar from one place and putting it in another place, you're changing how it actually is used, and that affects the production and the prices in the economy. Does that make sense?
I guess.
Yeah. So I think maybe the reconciliation has to come in and probably there's no way to know unless you actually try it. But as you ramp up the base level of the basic income,
yeah,
and we're saying at some point you run into inflation, or at some point you max out the productive capacity of the economy. What does that look like? What is the limiting thing?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's kind of two phases to how you might think about Alex's perspective. And one is the untapped productive capacity, stuff that he assumes we're not even at capacity yet. So first just get there. Right. And then the second stage would be let's say you're there and you said, you're not quite satisfied with the quality of life of the poorest people yet. Then what do you do? And even then you would have a slightly different approach of freeing up resources being the main goal versus freeing up dollars. But it's he also has this idea of, first of all, just let's get the untapped capacity going.
But it seems inflation is going to be driven by the things like meat,
right?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
that people who can't afford it now, the things that are not very elastic in supply, and that people that the demand rises for the most,
right?
Like meat and
so,
vegetable oil.
So we need to decide what are the prices. What prices do we care about? What prices do we want to put in our consumer price index? So if we put the price of something like meat in there, then maybe we'd have inflation with respect to that. But if we leave meat out, then maybe we wouldn't. And how you make that decision, it should really line up with what people think a dollar is worth. We want that to remain steady over time, feel that the dollar is worth the same amount. So a lot can go into making those decisions, and it can be really tricky. When we talked about stagflation in the 1970s, we asked whether oil should be part of it or not, whether that should be directly in the consumer price index.
That's a good point.
So those are interesting questions. I don't think what you would see when you reach the productive capacity of the economy is actual inflation. I think what you'd see is the central bank raising interest rates to keep consumer spending stable, reduce the amount of credit in the private economy, because now you've got consumer spending that's being funded in this other way.
Right.
But
that's kind of an intermediary buffer, right? Because at a certain point you'll reach the limit of that too.
Right. So what happens is we start to reach the limit of what the Fed can do by raising interest rates, or we get to the point where we're not comfortable with interest rates getting any higher, or we feel like it's going to start being bad for the economy for interest rates to get any higher. That's where we kind of reach the limit.
So they've got a little bit of
it's
warning
interest
sign
rates,
too before you hit inflation.
Yeah.
And that could be good for stability of the economy too, anyway.
Yeah. Richard.
Well, there's this whole, how do you say, there's a business wants to spend money upgrading their stove, but someone breaks their window or something like that, so that they have to go and replace their window instead and not fix their stove. But they count that as increasing GDP or something like that anyway. So you can say that how you use money could you change by how your circumstances are.
That's interesting.
I think that's a really good point. So yeah, if basic income in making our society more efficient, or people are harming each other less, that kind of thing, actually makes actually kind of preserve some resources and save some resources that can kind of increase the productive capacity of the economy right there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did you want to weigh in?
David?
I have two things.
Yeah.
First of all, I have told you before my opinion on increase in interest rates being a form of taxation, and I stick with that.
Yeah.
So, just saying, I strongly believe that they are, it's not a federal taxation, but it's
So
a form of taxation.
do you want me to comment on that right now, or do you want to say something else first?
My other thing is entirely unrelated to that comment.
All right. So I will say that.
Sir, can you just put that? Can you summarize that?
So basically, the fact that interest rates are higher means that the cost of capital is higher, effectively. Because a lot of the capital, at least in our economy, is borrowed capital. So even if you're not paying a tax to the government, you may be taking out a loan to invest it in something, and then you are making payments on that. So the investment becomes worth less because you may get the same return on it, but you're paying more in interest. So your actual return is going down, which makes it a kind of tax.
Yes. So I agree that you can frame it as a kind of tax. The only reason why I don't call it a tax is because it's not officially a tax, but it's a similar mechanism. It reduces the amount of spending in a part of the economy.
Mm-hmm. I understand that it's not technically a tax. It's so similar mechanically.
But it's a tax that does a specific thing. It reduces the amount of credit funded spending in the economy, and that's spending that's very skewed. You're able to borrow money if you already have money, that kind of thing. So what that does when there's more credit in the economy, when people are able to borrow more, this is actually how the Fed keeps prices high, because now there's an incentive for producers to keep prices high, because since the demand curve is so steep, if they lower their prices, they might get a few more customers, but they're going to lose in profit overall. So I think that's something I talk about too, how monetary policy affects the price elasticity of demand, and monetary tightening will lessen that. And that is kind of a tax. You could use an actual direct tax to kind of have a similar effect. But it's maybe I think the monetary policy is more direct on spending, because you're always kind of borrowing in order to be able to spend. It's different than kind of taxing people's wealth or something like that, even though the ability to have credit is a function of wealth. Go ahead, Richard.
There's it's like capital markets where in Japan their interest rates are really low, and so you can borrow from them, and then you change it into dollars, and then you can use that money to buy something in the U.S. And then you pay next to nothing in interest to Japan. So you can just keep doing that over and over and increase your wealth that way.
Yeah. Do you have a question, Katie?
Credit isn't just built on wealth, though, because, firsthand experience. I have no money, but I can take out a huge loan because I've consistently paid all bills on time.
Right.
So,
since I was 17.
Right.
So yeah, that's right. Credit is based on trust. And if someone is really rich and does have a lot of money, then you're more likely to trust that they're going to pay you back. But there are other ways to build that trust as well.
Yeah.
And then if you get into things like, people take, I have a friend that has $300,000 in student loan debt, and nothing to his name. He has no money, but he has $300,000, and it's based on the idea that he's going to make money because he will be a doctor.
Right.
Yeah,
So-
well, I understand that model, but
Yeah.
this is even outside of that for cars
Right.
and houses and things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this was a new world I was introduced
That's interesting.
to
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah.
Before we go to Richard, I want to get to
Oh no,
David's
it's,
second.
it's related
Yeah.
to that. I'm sorry, because my other thing is entirely unrelated.
All right,
And
yeah,
so I
go
just
ahead.
wanna-
I guess I just would add that he was just emphasizing one aspect of it, which is that if you look at how it is going to be distributed across the economy by income, all else being equal, like if you're wealthier, you can get more credit more easily. But that's just one factor that affects.
Right.
affects the
In
price,
general,
yeah.
over the economy, when we make credit easier, it allows disproportionately rich people to spend a lot more money and borrow more. Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I was watching a video a few days ago about how since China doesn't have a credit system, they're trying to create a social credit system where they like promote different things that they view as benefit for society. Like they were saying in the video, that you would lose your lower your credit score if you like played over a certain amount of video game hours and stupid things like that, or if you jaywalk or.
Yeah, so the actual credit system, everybody starts off with like an A rating, 1,000 points, and like the highest it counts for is like 1,100 points. So like you get 1,100 points, you're just getting better and better, but it doesn't mean anything. And they actually are recruiting people because it's a communist state to report on each other to lower other people's ratings. So if I see you jaywalking and I report you for jaywalking, I get a point and you lose 5 points.
Oh my god.
So there's a whole bunch of other problems with that, but generally speaking, the idea would be that they will, increase you can borrow money because you have a high social credit rating,
Right.
because they don't have a strong financial credit system. The other thing that they do there is if you default on a loan, the courts will supersede your phone, and anyone who calls you will hear a recorded message that says that you are a bad person and you do not deserve to be dealt with. So, like, there's a lot of other problems with what they do there, and so, like, they won't let you take airplanes anymore if you default on a loan. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah.
That's not a great
That's
example.
That sounds like
of it.
that Black Mirror episode where everyone's
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
actually said that in the video.
Yeah.
And they also have they're piloting different versions of it in different cities.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I hope they figure out that that's not the best way to go.
So
go
I
ahead,
wanted to go
David.
back to
Yeah.
like a very specific example because I do think it makes a point.
Yeah.
I think it makes your point more than your point, so I apologize, Nick. But everybody wants meat example. So in Russia, they have cowboys now. 10 years ago, there were 0 cowboys. Today, it's like 15,000.
Whoa.
And they actually import American cowboys.
Really?
Yeah. So they have these large steppes and grass plains,
Oh.
and the demand for beef there is increased even though the economy has gone down. So they've realized they can't continue to import beef. But they decided, well, we have these large grassy plains. Let's just give people jobs as cowboys,
Right.
effectively. So they're making, they have this huge, meat industry in Russia now that didn't even exist. This huge cattle industry that didn't even exist 10 years ago. And it's because the demand for the beef came up. So they pulled in they had realized there was extra capacity. Nothing
Right.
was being done with this grassland at the time. And they decided to devote extra resources towards producing the beef. Like, if there is a demand for something, like, human ingenuity will always find a way at the end of the day. Obviously they can't produce all the beef that everybody might want there, but, in general, like, we could produce a lot more meat by using some of that kind of resource. And so, like, kind of proving your point, like, capacity will increase, or the capacity will be focused on something to grow the capacity as it's demanded. And, we can actually reach capacity with everybody having a basic income because that capacity was there technically, it just wasn't utilized.
Right. We don't know what the potential capacity
Yeah.
is, and
Yeah.
we'll find out as soon as everybody has money to spend. Yeah.
So I do think that that does kind of double down on your point a little bit, and I think it's just kind of an interesting example of it with beef. Like just looking it up, because I'm like, no, this is a real thing, and I found some stuff about it. But there's about 15,000 Russian cowboys now that didn't exist, and they have herds of millions.
It's so interesting. Huh. All right. Well, let's get on to another quote.
Yeah.
So Adam Smith labeled the machine, the economy, or the markets, I suppose, the invisible hand. The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Smith, widely considered the father of economics, emphasized the economy's self-regulating nature, that agents independently seeking their own gain may produce the best overall result for society as well. today's economists build models, roadmaps of reality, if you will, to enhance our understanding of the invisible hand. So, I mean, I think it's true that there are things that automatically happen on their own in the economy in response to kind of people acting in their own interest. I don't think it's true that these things are automatically good. So I think, we can ask how can we set up a framework such that agents who are independently seeking their own gain is actually is not just it not just might produce the best overall result for society, but it actually does produce the overall result for society. So how do we set up the parameters in which the free market can operate optimally for the people?
But there's an issue of externalities like polluting the air or dumping
Yep.
sewage in the rivers or things like that. So you can like tax them,
Yep.
like the carbon tax.
Yep. So that's certainly part of it. Taxing externalities, taxing, like we were talking about before, taxing resource usage that is wasteful or that we want to free up. And also, if people actually, we care about people, it's hard to act in your maximal best interest if you don't have the money to buy for the economy to produce for you,
Right.
or to produce stuff for you. So I think that, I've said this before too, that, the economy, the market in particular, is going to benefit the people when the profit motive of the corporations, of the businesses, is aligned with the benefit of consumers. And the way you align that is by saying you're going to profit if you sell things that consumers want to spend money on. And the effect is greater if more of the consumers actually have money to spend. The effect is beneficial to more people if more people can be your customer.
Right now,
Yeah.
people are incentivized to build. Contractors are incentivized to build condos, but if they get $1,000 per month, then then they're incentivized to build a bunch of low rent apartments instead, because you have either 6 low rent apartments or a condo, and if they have charged the same amount of rent, then or more rent for the lower rent apartments, then you produce more lower rent apartments.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think in terms of how we want to model the economy theoretically, a lot of our existing models of the economy, it's really focused on labor. It's focused on workers, and it's not as much focused on the consumers. It's focused on jobs in the labor market, how to employ everyone, that kind of thing, rather than how to maximize everyone's benefit. So it can be hard to I don't think basic income really fits into the standard macroeconomic models, because it's not about creating jobs. It's not about, maximizing employment or that kind of thing. It's about maximizing benefit to the people. So yeah, I mean, how do you empirically test something that doesn't even fit in with your theoretical model?
Right. Well, I think there's an assumption, like, basically the reason that labor is central is that is the way that people are thinking of money happening, like people getting their consumer money.
Yes.
And so you're just sort of adding additional options.
Well, they're thinking about two things. They're thinking about it's the way consumers get their money, but it's also, thought of as labor is thought of as the way stuff in the economy is produced.
Right. So it's both.
Right.
And they're sort of tied together. And you're kind of decoupling. You decouple them from each other in your model.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Well, I decouple kind of both of those things from labor.
What were the other two things?
So the two things are how stuff is produced and how consumers get their money.
I see. Because labor is just one input.
And in standard models, they're both tied to labor, and they're tied to each other through labor. And I disconnect both of those connections.
But labor's still a resource into production.
Labor's still a resource. Yeah, for sure. So I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I just think that despite all of that, like, I think that that's a really nice example of a theoretical model, like Adam Smith's stuff, and like models of how the market works. Especially if you start from the perspective of like you don't think anything could work in an emergent way, and then you realize things can. Because I think emergent properties are actually quite counterintuitive for people, I find. So like evolution is another example.
Yep.
The fact that there's no like top-down process from which you get all this complexity that seems to sort of work successfully, and it actually just comes out of a kind of emergent process. There are aspects of the economy that are also like that, and I think models like that are some of the most beautiful because they model this really seemingly very true but also very like counterintuitive and otherwise hard to see thing, and they often do it with just a few simple principles, like the theory of evolution only takes a couple principles. So I think Adam Smith is like that too.
There's also the whole trickle down thing doesn't really exist. It's torrent up or something like that.
Right.
It's because everything is built from the bottom up. If you can't have a pyramid that suddenly drops down from the sky or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think by default, we should think of money as flowing from consumers to producers to investors, and that's kind of the direction it flows in. And then the question is, where is the source of that flow? So if you think about it as a river, where is that spending power coming from? And in our typical macroeconomic models, we say, oh, well, the money goes here, but then it's spent buying things, and then it comes back through the labor market, and there's kind of this cycle where the money funds itself as it circulates throughout the economy. But I don't think it's useful to think of money as circulating in the economy. I think it's useful to focus on that flow of consumer spending and then ask, well, how do we maximize that flow? How do we get that flow to be optimal for what the economy can produce? And the answer might not be by cycling it back either through the labor market or through taxes or something like that. It doesn't necessarily.
I guess just to add on to that, like at the very least, you would have to have some net flow away from consumers for there to be the profit motive for the companies to be doing their thing in the first place. So it's not going to be like a tight circle, right?
Yeah, well, it depends. So you could have you could have a profit motive where people are selling things to consumers and then buying things from labor, etc. And you could have a complete cycle there, but there'd be no accumulation of wealth. There'd just be like, I'm getting enough for my day to day, and I'm spending every day kind of what I earned through whatever means, and getting the things I need for that day. And you can kind of have a theoretical model for that. But that's not how it works. Like people like to get wealthier and accumulate money, and that's only a problem if we assume that this cycle is the way that things should work. Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
In ancient Athens, they actually had reputation where they built monuments, and they hired people to build those monuments, and they expected people to build monuments to fund social programs and things like that, and they looked down on people, on wealthy families didn't do that.
Oh, yeah.
So if you change our culture to have the wealthy benefit society through actual philanthropy, not through trying to model society after themselves, then that would be a way to improve things for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because like if you're making everybody build monuments, or like you're having everybody be your servants, like, so I don't know, Downton Abbey at least suggests that it was thought of as like another contribution to have like a ton of servants, because you're like employing all these people, but you're also spending all of their time, right? So you are employing them and like giving them some money, but there's also this cost of everybody's time being used in like this particular
inefficient
way.
ways, honestly.
Yeah, well, or at least there's not a lot of like option or choice, like Nick was bringing up earlier about like whether people want to be spending their time building monuments versus doing something else. Yeah. Or putting forks in the right place, or like whatever.
Forks in the right place is definitely how some people spend their time.
I mean, some people, yeah, and that's cool. They can be those servants, but yeah, I mean, like. But it's interesting what you're pointing out, Richard, which is like it, because of this view of labor in people's minds and in the models, like it often is seen as altruistic to employ all these people,
right?
Even if it's
jobs.
doing something totally meaningless, essentially, like it's just like a big costly signal of like having a bunch of servants in your house. Yeah, I find that interesting too.
Yeah. So I'm going to read one final quote, and then we can go around for final thoughts.
Wow, we're there already.
So no economic model can be a perfect description of reality, but the very process of constructing, testing, and revising models forces economists and policymakers to tighten their views about how an economy works. This, in turn, promotes scientific debate over what drives economic behavior and what should or should not be done to deal with market failures. Adam Smith would probably approve. Yeah.
Cool.
So let's get some final thoughts for people. Experiments versus theory, economic models, basic income.
I guess one thing we didn't talk a lot about is like how do you evaluate whether you have a good theory, which is kind of central to this.
Yeah.
Which can be a difficult thing to articulate. But like often you want to have like some pretty simple premises out of which you get a lot of predictions, many of which seem to be true and useful. And I think that there are a lot of really good models out there, including models that represent externalities like what Richard was talking about, represent how the market can work, represent what the government needs to do, and that can give like a lot of clarity there. So anyway, I think models are really great in that way. Especially I have more experience with the theoretical side. I like that kind of contrast. But I have good experience with that. Although I guess it'll be interesting to see, especially with machine learning and computers, which several people brought up, if we'll be doing more and more useful stuff with the economic, sort of the empirical side, now that we have so much more data and ability to process data. Maybe that will end up being interesting too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool to see better and more modeling of the scenarios that we've been talking about.
Right.
I wonder if that'll happen.
I bet it will. I do.
So one of the things that I hadn't really considered about, like, you know, we've kind of talked about this more extraneously before again, but the modeling is, it would be really hard to see the impact on capacity that this would have, because I think it would, you know, definitely shrink capacity in some ways for some things. Like the actual economic capacity for some things would go down, quite frankly. But it would also increase it in other ways and maybe focus it differently. Like, you know, if everyone wants meat, then all of a sudden a bunch of farmland that's now being, or land that's now being used for one thing would now be focused on cattle. And I just think that's kind of fascinating, but also kind of terrifying, quite frankly. Because I really think it would be very unforeseeable. Like, it'd be very hard to model human behavior in such a way that you don't know what the next hot thing's going to be. Maybe 1 week it's cattle and everyone wants to buy meat, and then we're, you know, putting solar panels on there because everybody needs electricity. Like, you know,
for their replicators.
Yeah, I mean, we really don't know, and it's really hard to tell. And I do think that would cause some waste, where it's like there's capacity and then it's being wasted, effectively like shifting production of, you know, it's just, it's a lot of detail.
Yep. Elizabeth.
I mean, for that, I mean, I feel like that's probably why you want to do like an incremental, so you're not just like having this huge shock to the economy, and so like having a, like slowly ramped up would mitigate some of that. That you're maybe not going to have quite that same drastic shift, but that's sort of an interesting point about. And I wonder, I mean, I guess in some ways, like waste is always going to be a part of the economy, because it's not, you're not going to be like, oh yes, like we have perfectly decided this is what all the things are. Like as you start to automate something, and you're like, okay, well we're trying to figure out like the best way to automate this, and you're not going to move from like zero automation to perfectly automated overnight. And so there's always going to be, in some ways, whether it's in technological development or like taste changing, as it's like, oh, like we've decided that like really like pears are like the cool new thing. Like we're not really so into apples, we're really into pears. And so like there's some waste as you shift, and you're like, okay, so like we're gonna replant some of these orchards. And
That's actually the consumer price index that the federal government uses to adjust for, you know, Social Security, et cetera. It does that. They actually switch oranges and pears and apples and pears and et cetera out every year. Because they say, well, you'll just substitute one for the other, and some of their substitutions are really bad, quite frankly. If you ever want to look at the list of some of the stuff they've done, they literally compare apples and oranges.
That's funny.
Actually, they don't. You wouldn't need to replant the orchards. You just graft pear branches onto those.
okay.
See, we got another.
I'm clearly not a horticulturist.
Richard, did you have any other thoughts?
Well, I was looking at an article recently about how the Seattle's $15 minimum wage, how that they got a bunch of money into the market, and it didn't cause inflation. Like the Little Caesars or whatever, pizza's still $5 everywhere, even outside the city. Well, basic income wouldn't necessarily cause inflation, just like the $15 minimum wage.
Oh, so that's okay. Sorry. Opposing points.
Go ahead, Katie.
Katie, no.
Okay. So I just wanted to mention to Bethany's point about maybe having more empirical modeling in economics. There actually has been kind of a huge shift in the last couple decades in economics from theoretical modeling to more empirical modeling. And there's arguments about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing or good in some ways, and that kind of thing. But in terms of the papers that are appearing in academic journals, there's a lot more empirical and a lot less theoretical. Partly just because it's gotten so cheap and easy to run models, do the data.
Right. And the theoretical stuff is really hard in a different way. Right.
And then you had a question about how do you know if a theory is right or wrong?
Or good, I would even.
How do you know if a theory is good?
Yeah.
And one way you can know is that even without testing a theoretical model, you can still find internal contradictions in the model. So just to bring up the example of labor again, if your model says the labor market is going to provide sufficient incomes to people to buy everything the economy can produce, and if your model also says that the labor market is going to, allocate labor efficiently for production, then you arrive at a contradiction when you have to use economic policy to create jobs or minimum wage or something like that. Right. So you can kind of look at the existing contradictions and try to figure out what's wrong with your model or your theory. Yeah. So thanks, guys. This was a great discussion. Next week, we're talking about the prison system.
Yes.
I mean, not nice.
Yes,
No, you're very excited about the prison system.